back to Sarah to talk a bit about some of the kind of issues around risk, which again is a massive subject. So Sarah, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Nigel. And yes, you guys will be very glad to know that no, I'm not inside a jacuzzi. It is actually an off-grid cabin somewhere in Scotland. So I'm just going to spotlight that. So hopefully you can see my flip chart or my whiteboard that I have here. Yes, it was one of the key things that I brought from the office home. So I'm going to just take the next 10 minutes to talk about a subject that often inspires, in fact, doesn't inspire any enthusiasm whatsoever, because when people need to go into risk workshops, they're generally seen as being one of the most boring activities that we have to do in the working environment. And that's unfortunate, because risk is one of those mechanisms that is entrenched in so many of our regulations, in our expectations. It's something that's very easy to insert into policy. And if done right, it can make a massive difference to what's going on in an organization. So what I'm going to attempt to do is to build on all of the fabulous thoughts and ideas that we've heard earlier on in today's session, and say, okay, how can we use risk to actually make some of this a reality? So risk should not be one of those tick box approaches. It should not be something where people get entrenched in arguing over the likelihood of something or where a risk should sit on a red, amber, green matrix. To be honest, many organizations have ditched that because it doesn't work. And instead, they're adopting a much simpler form of risk management that is easier to integrate into everything we're already doing in an organization, but also be able to see risks as a network of things that are going on rather than just lots of individual silos. So to do this, I'm going to try and share two little diagrams with you. And the first one builds on the concept of known knowns and known unknowns. So this is a form of Johari window, or I'm sure many of you will remember the likes of Donald Rumsfeld saying that there are some things that we know, there are some things we know we don't know, and there are some things we don't know, so therefore it wasn't my fault. No, he didn't say that last bit, but that's what is perhaps inferred when people blame things on happening because they didn't know about stuff. No longer is that a good enough excuse for leaders. Things go on in our organizations the entire time that we don't know about. But if they manifest in a big way, it's still us that loses our jobs. If you look at Rio Tinto and the 46,000-year-old caves that they blew up back on the 24th of May, the CEO may or may not have known what was going on there, but he's the one that lost his job. So coming back to my little flip chart that I have here, and as you can see, I've split it into my quadrants, and up in the top right-hand corner, this is where we have our known knowns. And in the area of known knowns, there is zero uncertainty here, okay? Because there is no uncertainty, that means that there is no risk. So for a risk to be a risk, it has to be something that has an element of uncertainty, and if it impacts on us, we're going to care about it. Risks are also not just negative things, they can be positive things as well. So we're looking for both potential threats and opportunities. That's what enterprise risk management is all about. So in this top right-hand corner, we've got our known knowns, and these things here are facts, not alternative facts, they are real facts. These things are things like incidents, they might be events, they might be issues, okay? So there's a lot of language we can use with regards to our facts. But as soon as we inject an element of uncertainty into this particular system here, so we now have our known unknowns, now we come into our area where we have our risks, okay? Now, these are the risks that it doesn't matter what sort of organization we're in. These are the risks that we've probably got listed out on some of the world's most boring spreadsheets, or if we're lucky, in a piece of highly expensive software. These are the risks that we're talking about. These are the risks that we might be fed by regulators to say, you've got to keep an eye on these things over here. These are the risks that because things have gone wrong or right elsewhere, they're now on our agenda. We're saying, right, we've got to keep an eye on this. Therefore, these risks here, they are acknowledged. Okay, so we call these our acknowledged risks. This then takes us into our third quadrant, and this is where we have our unknown unknowns. And it's in here that we have those risks that, to be completely frank, without well, we haven't got enough imagination to try and predict these. These are only seen with hindsight. These are the risks that are true surprises. Okay, and sometimes we call these risks over here are black swans. Now, we've heard the term black swan a lot over the last 10 months because lots of people say that COVID was a black swan, which, if you're using this definition of a black swan, is utter rubbish. We've always known that there's been a potential for a big global pandemic. It's just we all secretly hoped it wouldn't happen on our watch. And so as a result, we were wholly unprepared for it, or most organizations were unprepared for it. Therefore, COVID wasn't a black swan in its own right. It was something else that I'm going to come on to in a second. But just to round off on this, a black swan is a risk that we are totally surprised by. The reason why they're called black swans is for those of us in Europe, we all used to think that swans were all white until some intrepid explorers got on a boat and went all the way to Western Australia. And lo and behold, what colour can swans be in Western Australia? Yes, they can be black. And those sailors were so surprised, they were like, wow, we're going to call a surprise a black swan. I am embellishing this story wholeheartedly because, to be honest, if I was a sailor on that boat, I would have been more surprised by the giant hopping rats, also known as kangaroos, rather than the black swans. But hey, that's just me. So black swans, those are the things that are true surprises. And if we begin to point our fingers at things that we think might be black swans, they're no longer black swans because we're beginning to talk about them. And if we've got a really mature organization, we will acknowledge them as being potentially risks, and then we can potentially do something about them. But what most organizations do is they slot into our final quadrant up here, where again, we have known unknowns. These again are risks, but these things up in this quadrant here, these are the risks that we are not talking about, or we're certainly not talking about formally. These are the risks that when something goes wrong and it turns into a fact and you go and do the investigation and they say, oh, I could have told you about that. Well, great. Why didn't you? Why didn't we move it down into this acknowledged risks territory down here in this bottom right-hand corner? These risks up here, they are our unacknowledged risks. Okay, these are our unacknowledged risks. There are unacknowledged risks. Sometimes we call these the elephants in the room, okay? And this can be called all kinds of things, different things around the world. The most useful thing we can do in our risk assessment and our risk workshops is to empower people to point at what they think those elephants in the room are. And by pointing at them and beginning to talk about them, we can then move them down into our acknowledged risks territory. By doing this, we are integrating into our normal working process ways of being able to identify the stuff that everybody knows about, but they don't necessarily want to talk about. Now, elephants exist for a number of different reasons. It can either be because we assume that somebody else is already doing something about it, or it can be because we're just not confident enough to be able to suggest it. Or, as often happens, we think that people only want to know about the big risks. We think that people only want to know about the material risks, and that's a problem because risks don't happen in silos. Risks happen as a network. And one person's risk might be somebody else's cause, might be somebody else's consequence, etc. No longer do we talk about parent risks and daughter risks. Okay, we need to be able to think about all of this stuff as a network. So by sharing these elephants, even if they're tiny little baby elephants, we can begin to create a better network of what we think might be going on in our organizations, and therefore be able to build up a better picture of saying, okay, if this thing over here changes, what does that mean for the rest of our system or the rest of our picture? So this is how risk management is beginning to change. Traditional risk management only focuses in on those acknowledged risks. What's happened, especially during COVID, is people have gone, you know what, we really need to get a grip on these elephants because we're not doing a very good job here of being perhaps resilient as an organization. How do we make sure that risk management as a mechanism really supports all of this? So the final thing that I'm going to mention just before I pass back to the fabulous Nigel is Risk management processes, again, we make them really, really complicated. But risk management is just a decision-making process. That's all that we're doing here. And it consists of 4 simple steps. And this is going to be super small for you, my apologies. So 4 simple steps. And these 4 simple steps are as follows. Step number 1 is all about understanding the context of the world in which we're operating and what we're trying to achieve. People will often just talk about objectives, but it's bigger than that. It's what is the purpose that we're trying to achieve. This therefore allows us to peel back the lid on where we have conflicts between our objectives and our values as organizations, or peel back conflicts on, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. There are conflicts between all of those as well. So what is it that we're trying to do? Okay, and what is the context? Then what are the risks that we're trying to, what we might face within these, be they potential threats or opportunities? How are we going to manage them? And how are we going to monitor and review them? And this is a cyclical process. And the reason why I enter this into the discussion now is to say that when we're talking about our risk management, we constantly need to be saying at every level in the organization, based on the context in which we're trying to operate and what we're trying to achieve, so our purpose, and the potential threats and opportunities that we face with regards to that, and our ability to actually manage that and take control of the uncertainty surrounding it. Is it actually possible to achieve our purpose and those objectives? Is it possible to do it, given the context in which we're operating and our management actions we can insert? If the answer is yes, then great, you've got everything in balance and you can carry on forwards. If the answer is no, then you've got 2 options. You either pump more time, money, and effort into managing those risks. Okay, so we need to be aware that this is going to cost us, not necessarily in terms of money, but it may well do in terms of time. So we need to be able to pump more into it in that area. If we can't do any more management of that, then it takes us back to that context and objectives piece again. And the bit that we can change there are our objectives and perhaps even our purpose. So those are the 2 levers that we get to pull. And what quite often happens is we set ourselves these massive targets as organizations without thinking how much effort is it going to take to actually deliver on these. And by making sure that our organization's out of sync or out of balance, it introduces huge amounts of stress into our companies, into our organizations. Whereas actually sometimes we need to listen to the workforce, listen to all those people around about us and say, okay, given this system, is it possible? And if it's not possible, and if I can't find the resources to help us manage it, let's revisit that purpose, or let's revisit those objectives we're trying to achieve. So, Mr. Nigel, back to yourself. Swans, elephants, and any other animals you can think of. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And you managed to get kangaroos and giant jumping rats in there too, didn't you? So it's good going. All things that are probably lurking outside your cabin even as we speak. So thank you for that. I mean, the obvious question that arises from all of that is that I know from having worked in things like the She Show and other places where you're dealing with organizations in what they would perceive themselves to be high risk sectors, but all the other organizations outside of those probably don't think that they are. They just ignore it. So what is it? What's the challenge we face in trying to change that willful blindness that so many non-risky, as they would see it, organizations have?
Yeah, so I mean, every organization has risk. Every organization faces risk. And it might be a case of they're facing financial risk or legal risk. It doesn't have to be on the health and safety side. And actually, this is one of the biggest hurdles that risk management often encounters, is that if you are in a heavy industry, say mining, often, especially in the front line, and people think that risk management is just about health and safety. Well, it's not. It's actually about everything coming together in that network and being able to balance up those decisions. Because if we don't do that, then we end up with bigger disasters on our hands. For example, coming back to Rio Tinto and the caves, one of the reasons why that blast happened was that they'd gone so far down that scenario before they realized what they were doing. The safest thing to do was to blast. And the number one value in a company like Rio Tinto is safety. And so safety was almost used, and I'm being fairly provocative here, as the easy way out to a very difficult situation. They should not have blasted those caves. We know they shouldn't have blasted those caves, but safety was the #1 value. It trumped production, okay, in this particular sense here. Well, actually, it aided production, to be perfectly frank. It gave them access to 80 million quid's worth of iron ore. But what they didn't do was say, well, hang on a second, our #4 value is respect. Are we respecting the local community with regards to blowing up these caves? And I think that's something there where this tension that you often get between values, between different requirements, how can you actually recognize that there's tension there and say, that's okay, let's embrace it. And on a case-by-case basis, say, well, what's the decision to make? I don't think I've quite answered your question, but it was a nice story.
Well, indeed, yeah, and probably you've raised about 17 others, which is generally the way it works when we're having a conversation. But it's true, isn't it? There's so much in there about this that applies to every organisation of every size. If you start to recognise those 4 boxes, those 4 quadrants, you can apply it to absolutely anything. And I think it needs to come out of the closet of health and safety and risky industries and into everybody else's mainstream. We just haven't quite got there yet. But I'm sure you'll push that forward, and I know some of us around here will. It's fascinating, though, isn't it, to consider that you were saying about the black swan thing of COVID. The trouble is, people are allowed to get away with saying, "I didn't know." To which the correct response is, "Well, go and find out."
Well, exactly, and I think, well, I have to say that I think almost now gone are the days where people can hide behind a black swan. And actually, because the way you eradicate black swans or reduce them, you're never going to get rid of all of them, is by getting your elephants to come down here, because then you understand more about what's going on in the organization. That will reduce this. But whether we take things like Volkswagen and emission scandals, okay, when that first came out, they said we didn't know about it. Utter rubbish. Of course, the CEO knew. Volkswagen, I think at last count, what, $36 billion in fines. The CEO will go to jail for years if he gets extradited to California, etc. Boeing, for example, well, that is yet another one where people stuck their heads in the sand. They pretended it was a black swan, and it wasn't really. Or at least the organization knew, and we weren't listening to the organization, and we weren't putting that into our decision making.
And that's a key point about all of this, isn't it? About the ability of people to not blow the whistle in the legal sense, but to actually point, as you say, to point at the elephants and go, that's not a black swan, it's an elephant, and we actually know it's there. I can see it. I think one of the things that we've seen in COVID responses has been that when you've got leaders who come from an alpha male charismatic background, they see challenges of things they can defeat just by being big and tough. Look at the US response to COVID and ours. Yeah. Then you compare that to the response in New Zealand or in Germany, some of the places where they took a different respect.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really good point to make, to say, okay, there are some risks that, yes, we can solve them. In the words of health and safety, yes, we can terminate them. But actually, the vast majority of risks really that we try to manage as an organization, again, be they potential opportunities or threats or a bit of both, actually, they're too complicated to solve. And so therefore, instead of solving them, there's a mindset of tackling them. There's a whole world of research on wicked problems, etc., which you tackle rather than trying to solve. So you know you've got to do something, you don't quite know what the right answer is, but you've got to start tugging at those threats and say, well, what does this network look like? And that mindset shift is fantastic, because it says, we don't know what it is we're going to do yet, or we can do, but let's at least acknowledge it, get it on the table and start talking about it. And then we can make a plan. And also we can acknowledge that plan might not work.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
At least we are making a decision to move forwards rather than stick our heads in the sand.
Absolutely. And the key leadership skill, the ability to recognize reality and steer, rather than be pig-headed about the fact that you've said something, therefore you must be right.
Yeah.
I would never dream of doing a thing like that. As the first 35 years of my career proved. Thank you for that. I think this plays very nicely into the following session with Anthony.